Hey, it's Soul, and today I want to declare total war against the design of borrowed power in the world of Warcraft. This might seem a little bit out of character from my usual devil's advocate attitude, but in this case, it blows. It just blows. It disrespects everyone's time. It demotivates players from investing their time into their characters, and this whole approach needs to change. Today, I will try to convince you to say no to borrowed power if you're not already on board, and to eliminate any doubt in Blizzard's hive mind that doing away with it is crucial for the long-term health of the game. You may disagree with me on many or all of these points, so please feel free to discuss this with me in the comments. I've talked this over many times, and I'm revisiting it again because today I have hope. Hope that the immovable monolith that is Blizzard design philosophy is shifting under the weight of our feedback or our pressure, probably our unsubscribing from the game, and more than a few mean comments. My hope comes from the developer Q&A with Game Director Ion Hazzikostas and Mike from Preach Gaming. Mike got Ian to talk about borrowed power at length, and it's a good one. This is a good clip. Bullet points and summaries really it's not going to do this justice, so I'm going to have the entire 7 or 8 minute clip, which I might get in trouble for. Mike, please don't be mad. Here's the clip. Or use the navigation bar to skip it if you got perfect recall, and we'll come back together in a bit to talk about WoW's possible future.
I do want to talk about systems of borrowed power. This is kind of a broader subject. It was kind of a recent thing. We brought in Legion. And now at this point, systems and the idea of most of the class growth being borrowed power has become kind of a WoW staple in the last couple of expansions. It definitely feels that this is anecdotal from me, obviously. It's worn a bit thin because we see a lot of things being taken away from us, like we saw with Legion to BFA. Then it returns in some slightly altered form, so we know a lot of the legendaries in the game are just tier set bonuses that we used to have, or they're modified versions of Legion legendaries. And we seem to be going around in this circle of, here's some new stuff, we're going to take it away, later on we're going to give it you back. And how do you guys see this long term? Are we going to see next expansion, the Convoke the Spirits legendary, for example?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly, as we saw with the Legion artifacts, there are some things that end up feeling so iconic and so successful that people want to keep them in some form, and we generally find ways to make that happen. On the topic broadly, we agree. This is something we talk about a ton internally when we look at our systems design and the direction we want to take for following expansions. I think looking back to how we ended up here in the first place was, honestly, I would say about 10 years ago. The development team came to the realization that permanent, evergreen, layered expansion of systems, character complexity, abilities just wasn't infinitely sustainable. That if you're giving people 3 new abilities every expansion, if you're adding new professions, you're adding permanent enhancements, at some point the system kind of collapses upon itself. There's homogenization, there is just general ability bloat and complexity that is where things are being added because something has to be added, not because the game needs it. And so that led to us pulling significantly back from that, really from Mists onwards. And what we saw in Warlords was the feeling of well, there's kind of nothing. There were Draenor perks that you got while leveling up, but I don't think those were tremendously exciting. And players didn't feel like
Wolf? Come on.
Yeah, exactly. and there just felt like a significant gap there. And so the idea was, okay, well, if we're not comfortable with permanent, expansions and additions to players' characters, what if we do temporary ones? What if we pull out all the stops? And I think the Legion system was probably the most successful of all of these for a couple of reasons. It was certainly very fantasy forward, but also, frankly, it was new.
Yeah,
people hadn't people hadn't understood where it was headed. People didn't get their Ashbringer and think to themselves, well, wait, what's going to happen 3 years from now? How are they going to fix this? How are they going to move on from this? It was just, no, I'm getting all these cool powers. I am getting stronger, doing awesome things with my weapon, doing awesome things with my class hall. And then we saw at the end of Legion when we had to burn out your artifact because was, literally more than doubling your power and adding a dozen different effects to your character that were not sustainable going forward to people who hadn't even played that expansion, that felt pretty crappy. And so I think looking forward, we want to find a middle ground. I think we want to look, we're discussing ways of getting back to how we can still have that core RPG element of permanent advancement of your character, of I'm a mage and I went to the Shadowlands and I overcame these foes and I learned things and I came back as a better mage. Not, I had this thing while I was there that I left behind that I never get to use again. And we'll have more to talk about how those philosophies express themselves, in the year to come. I think this is not a mid-expansion pivot, but we agree with a lot of the community feedback about the risk of borrowed power just feeling like just a treadmill where you want growth, you want forward movement, you don't want to get something then lose it, then get something new that replaces it, then lose it, and we want to find a way out of that trap.
Well, it feels like you're going in the opposite direction now, right? Because you're now bloated with borrowed power things. In the other, in the same vein as like making all the legendaries, is there's so much stuff now of the 3 expansions that's been given and then taken away. Is that now there's a huge array of things, and there's certainly the problem we had coming into BFA when you started saying, okay, we'll put some of these into the talent trees. Is that but we had both of those originally, so it was a much better combo. I want to talk about the fear you guys expressed, and I remember the discussion that you brought up earlier is that we can't just keep adding new talent rows endlessly. It's just not going to work. And you said you were fearful of how that would look. Would it be a blade storm that fills a raid by the end of it? Things like that. Are you still having that fear, or is that something you're willing to relax on in order to add in these features long term?
I think we have. I think the answer is both. We absolutely have that fear, but we have to be willing to relax it a little bit and engage with that fear to some extent. I think the concern, and I can speak to this firsthand. A dozen years ago, I was a class designer working on classes, trying to come up with, along with doing counter design, trying to come up with, okay, what are the new Death Knight abilities going into Cataclysm? What are the new Rogue abilities going into Cataclysm? And a lot of the time, you had well-rounded classes that didn't have clear things they needed, but just there's an obligation that, okay, we're adding 5 new levels, 10 new levels, we need to give them 3 or 4 new abilities. And those are not necessarily the best design things. You end up with, okay, it's an extra cooldown. That's easy. Everyone's going to like it.
Are you responsible for Dark Sim?
Perhaps. That's what a rare case where
great ability.
A rare case, because when working as both a class designer and an encounter designer, I could write a check for my other self to cash because that was a huge burden on encounter design. But hey, if I can sign up for it, no problem.
Yeah, for sure.
But and I think the risk is when we're adding stuff because we need to add stuff, rather than we're adding stuff because we have a cool idea, because it's going to make the class, it's going to make the experience more fun, it's going to give them some new way of engaging with group content or whatever else. And so that's the trap we want to avoid. But I don't think the answer is let's do none of it. Let's give you no permanent additions to your character and have everything temporary. I think we need to find a middle ground where, and we've always had borrowed power in some form. I mean, we were talking about set bonuses earlier. The gear and sets were like the original form of that, right? You have these extra things that modify your rotation, that modify the way your character plays. Then you leave them behind and you move on to the next tier and you get something new. And it's all about finding a balance.
Yeah, for sure. I think we've gone very heavily in the other direction now, right? With several systems all doing those things. But it's definitely something that we see more and more as like a recycling, which obviously feels bad from both sides. I'm sure you guys would like to be a bit more creative as well with the stuff that you get to put out there for the players.
Absolutely, yes. And looking again, we'll have a lot more to share beyond Shadowlands. I think, though, getting back to it, I think we're happy with the Shadowlands ecosystem, the range of how those things interact with each other, the choices players have to make, the depth to the characters. We just want to find a way to carry that forward in a more permanent way, and not have to come up with a brand new system that people will go into in our next expansion already beginning to ask and knowing that it's going to be temporary and that they're going to have to leave it behind.
Whoop-de-doo. But words are wind, right? In spite of my enthusiasm, I think it's appropriate to say because statements and intentions don't often translate into whatever game design fantasies are cooking in our heads. Mike was right to point out that despite Ian's alleged intentions to find a compromise for borrowed power, today we as Shadowlands players are entangled in a web of features and perks that we fully expect will go away, or they'll deactivate when we finally leave the Shadowlands and return to Azeroth. What's more awkward is that when we do return, we do have a Heart of Azeroth that is, for the most part, fully functional, and that's gonna have to be dealt with too. Unless suddenly we go out to space in like the next expansion. But this exchange got me excited for a World of Warcraft that can, for lack of a better word, reset its philosophies. The expansion after Shadowlands can be fantastic if they follow through, but before I get into some brief examples on how, I'll banter for a bit, because, you know, that's kind of my thing. Legion certainly did feel like both the best and the worst of the borrowed power systems when I consider how I felt at the time. Like, hey man, we got this cool ass weapon, we got a clubhouse that didn't care about faction divisions and stuff. Our power grew, and it grew, and then the next thing you know, we were fighting titans. And then the Battle for Azeroth came, or the pre-patch came, and all that cool stuff went away. We leveled up in Zandalar and Kultiris, and at around level 116, our legendaries, some of which took months for us to obtain, they no longer worked. The awkward slide or fall from Legion to Battle for Azeroth finished with Azerite gear that probably couldn't be fully activated yet because we didn't have enough artifact power. Personally, I'm the type who, despite being a commentator for the World of Warcraft, I could still re-immerse myself into the game and simply enjoy things as they are with this, this kind of narrow-minded wonder. But I was also very conscious as soon as Blizzard announced Battle for Azeroth and Shadowlands. Like, I distinctly remember on the BlizzCon floor thinking to myself, hey, we're getting all this cool stuff. Better enjoy it while it lasts. It's really, really easy to fall into a cynical mindset. Despite some of the less savory exchanges that I've had with some fellow gamers, I totally understand where you're coming from. It's one thing knowing that as we tackle one threat on Azeroth after another, we're going to eventually move on to another again. And with that comes like new gear and new buttons to press, new levels, etc. It's another thing when we're groomed into one newfangled system after another. Artifact weapons, and the Order Hall tree, and the Heart of Azeroth, and essences, and corruption, and soulbinds, and covenant abilities, and all the legendaries that we've earned along the way, and then we end up shoving those into our void storages. All that time that developers and designers put into these features, they just faded into the memories of players at the time, maybe to be revived in an upcoming classic version. Ian made a good and maybe a nostalgic point that gear was the original borrowed power, and it still functions the same way, just to a lesser degree because of the lack of set bonuses, which we learned will be back in patch 9.2. But gear and set bonuses also have a pretty short shelf life. They're like a double-edged sword because the Season 1 set bonus, that might be terrific. But the Season 2 bonus might be bad enough that you'll consider holding on to that first set. On the brighter side though, when things do work out, when things are good, players just slide from Season 1 to Season 2 gear. It's not a new system necessarily, it's just new gear, higher item level, a new bonus that is hopefully meaningful, hopefully a meaningful change to gameplay. I don't pretend to know any better about game design, but I'm sure it's kind of a pain in the butt to think of like 36 set bonuses per spec times 2, because 2 and 4 set bonuses, and do that across 3 tiers/seasons of content. But this sort of system is certainly easier for players to understand. Growth is a naturally important part in an RPG. In the World of Warcraft, the road of what I'm going to call regular growth took place from vanilla to Warlords. The road was pretty bumpy too, right? There was a talent tree growth to the birth of specializations, and then shifting entirely away from the talent tree. But our characters haven't truly grown since the Mists of Pandaria. We just got more achievements and bigger transmog collections. It was at this point, the fear, as Ian calls it, the fear of too much growth changed character design into what it is today. Temporary. But Ian shared that the team needs to confront those fears of bloat for the sake of growth, permanence, roleplay, long-term. As he said, so that mage can overcome the challenges of the Shadowlands, for example, and return to Azeroth a better mage. Kind of a hint that maybe they will do this in the expansion after Shadowlands. From another angle, maybe a more business or practical view, I think it's a good idea for an MMO to invest the finite amount of time, labor, and money into lasting features. Maybe the designers over at Blizzard don't want to feel bored and continually working on the same system over and over. And while players don't like being bored either, watching 2 years of effort go away in a patch is a little discouraging. Over the past few years, I've observed all sorts of suggestions, like feature improvements for the likes of Island Expeditions and Warfront and Broken Shore and the Mage Tower, and right now with Torghast. I had a lot of high hopes for it, and I still do, but even if over the next few patches Torghast turns out to be this wonderful playground of violence, it may still be destined to be another monument of forgotten and apparently disposable design. I really don't like speculating on this particular subject, but if I was a WoW engineer or a WoW designer or whatever, and I was cooking up a feature that I thought would be really cool, only for it to come out half-baked and then forgotten, maybe even like deleted in a few years, I'd probably feel discouraged enough to find another team more willing to go all in, more willing to face those fears. That's why Ian's words got me all excited, maybe hopeful for WoW's future. Maybe the ship is starting to course correct in a meaningful way that'll shape the next era of World of Warcraft, like post Shadowlands. But it's got to happen. It's got to. The fans, the critics, the streamers, and content creators, big and small, we've got to shout from the rooftops and say no more borrowed power. Redirect the time, the labor, and the money towards features with a mindfulness that when the expansion is over, that feature, that thing, will persist. But there's the elephant in the room. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten. Class growth, right? It needs a new solution. How can Blizzard minimize bloat without making it into a borrowed power? How can they stop their process of giving and then taking away and then giving back these abilities and talents and bonuses? One answer, not the answer, but one answer to hopefully inspire some thought lies with altering this talent tree into one that can grow horizontally. This means that Blizzard can add any number of options that they like, but players would be making the same 7 or 6 or 7 choices or so, using the current talent rows as an example. The World of Warcraft has 17 years worth of talents, abilities, and more that can be filled up here, but by limiting the number of choices, it curbs the power bloat. It defines our characters as champions with infinite potential, but not infinite upward growth to sort of keep them grounded. Another example I pointed out once upon a time, skill loadouts, found in a lot of games, such as Diablo 3, where nearly all of your abilities have options that alter the way the ability works. And over time, there can be tons and tons of options, but you'll still only make that one choice per ability. I think by taking that route, it gives Blizzard a lot more flexibility to maybe consider adding a bit of bloat, like a few abilities that can also be altered with talents. And going forward, they can add in as many talents as they like. If players end up not using abilities in favor for another, I think everyone can accept that. I've got a few more bullet points that I think the WoW team ought to invest into in the aftermath of this whole no borrowed power movement. You're going to hear some specifics too. Don't take them too seriously though, just about all of them are going to be bad, right? I'm just stuck in that high where, you have neat ideas like, right now for WoW, what would it be like if it were like this and that, and would you play it? And I'd be like, yeah. It's pretty late tonight, by the way. Professions. They've been woefully neglected for years, and I've even gone as far to say in the past that they've never had a great impact on the game. Professions are like the original expansion feature, adding in new things to make, armor, weapons, enchants, gems, glyphs, when glyphs did something. An entire pseudo-progression system can be built around that, where players can, go out into the world somewhere, finding materials or something, and invest into special gems and enchants that can alter abilities, weapons and armor with special effects and perks. My first warlock still has his frozen Shadowweave set, I pronounced that great, from Burning Crusade, because that set was, like freaking amazing. Here's another thought. Like, it's a really dumb thought. I just decided to add this thing in, but let's say we have a piece of gear, a weapon that has a special effect built into it. You hit something and then it has a chance to spawn a tentacle. Woohoo! You disenchant that weapon, and then you turn it into an enchanting scroll that you can sell. And then someone can use it and use that to enchant their weapon. And killing that rare or boss or whatever it is for that weapon and disenchanting it is the only way to get that enchant. It sounds dumb now that I've said it out loud. I'm just thinking that post-level progression doesn't have to be this really long-tail system that needs to be learned. Maybe all it takes is a bit of gold and gathered materials and, of course, RNG. I'm totally doing professions a disservice by keeping this short, but I really gotta move on. So, outdoor world content. Even if you may not like Covenant or anima farming, the Covenant Sanctum is a pretty solid example, maybe an incomplete example, but a pretty good example of a cool expansion feature that includes world content, and it offers meaningful choice that expresses player identity, maybe not through power, but from a visual and roleplay level. To a lesser extent, Blizzard can go all in with, reputations and offer full transmog ensembles to factions old and new for players who really want to represent the Timbermaw. I know as far back as the Shadowlands announcement, people were pretty pissed off about the idea of choosing the Covenant and choosing the Covenant ability. Many had said, hey, maybe we should just be able to swap out whatever we like. My take on it was, well, why don't you just take the whole thing out and just leave it as these cosmetic choices? Forget the abilities, forget the conduits, forget the soul binds, just have the cosmetics and the Sanctum to restore, and that's it. But let's move on to Torghast. It's still up in the air, obviously, but it's got the potential to be like an entirely separate game if Blizzard wants it to. And yeah, I really think it can. Picture this. In the first major patch of every expansion, so in the upcoming 10.1, 11.1, etc., etc., etc. In the first major patch of all these expansions, Torghast kind of reopens, not unlike the Brawlers Guild. And then players can use that to get their alts to the current max level. And then there's like new boss floors that pop up every now and then where you fight old rare mobs or maybe even a dungeon boss. How about gear that drops from Torghast for Torghast? Kind of like how PvP will be in 9.1, where this Torghast gear is strongest in the content, in the Torghast content that you get it from, but it is at least functional outside of it. From there, I would love to see some common things like an endless mode, a leaderboard for time and rewards. And, as for like all the other rewards that you would get, just include this whole cosmetic junkyard for anything that Blizzard decides to put onto those boss loot tables. And of course, what sort of fan would I be if I didn't mention player housing? The endgame of endgame, where you can hang Argus's helmet and show off your gladiator titles in this museum, this monument to your greatness. Or you can make a home for your murder hobo champion to finally rest their feet. You can make this thing look like a bar or a palace or the next Goldshire, whatever you want. And people who don't care for player housing will only get rich off the materials that they'll end up gathering and selling on the auction house. Maybe you can make your own community neighborhood in the nicer part of Elwyn Forest, where everyone's roof must be red and have no more than 3 lawn murlocs out in the yard, or you're gonna move out. Okay, I'm just getting carried away now. I'm just excited over the idea of jumping into a new expansion announcement and hearing Blizzard talk about something that they're going to do to the core parts of the game. The stuff that's held WoW together, not the stuff that's that we know is going to be discarded. Because I'll tell you this, when there is a new expansion announced, I do not want to hear about a brand new feature that fits the expansion's theme, because that's going to set off all sorts of red flags for a lot of people, and even for me. I don't know about you, but to me, it would feel demotivating. I'm going to wonder, what's the point if whatever I work towards is so temporary? And I get it, this is a video game, but run with me here. I just don't want to think about whether continuing this borrowed power thing is going to make me just quit. So Blizzard, please just don't do it.